This will be a presentation over using the pandemic to relate and introduce cybersecurity concepts. This will be an analysis and discussion of the following scholar paper. Pandemic Parallels: What can cybersecurity learn from COVID-19? Written by Stephen Furnell, Julie Haney, and Mary Theophanos. As a non-CS major, I had not been exposed to cybersecurity concepts prior to this class. However, as we continue to study this course, the more I'm starting to realize how important of a topic it is. Therefore, I chose my topic for this paper to be over regarding the education of cybersecurity, as I believe that most people, both STEM and non-STEM majors, are not familiar with cybersecurity concepts, as they can be complicated and difficult to understand initially. But during the pandemic, we were more at risk than ever of a cyber attack, as most schooling and business was conducted online. And cybersecurity helps both maintain confidentiality and integrity of businesses, institutions, and personal life. For an introduction to this paper, the authors strive to create a relation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many challenges to the topic of cybersecurity, with their main goal being to emphasize the importance of, as well as bring awareness to the field of cybersecurity. The author's discussions in relations to the pandemic will help familiarize the reader with the basic practices of cybersecurity. And by having something to relate it to, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all experienced, I believe it's going to help solidify the cybersecurity concepts much easier. These relations can also be used to explain more complex cybersecurity practices, which I will discuss in a later slide. So first, the authors start off by explaining basic habits utilized during the pandemic in such a way that will help relate cybersecurity concepts. So the CDC instructed to minimize the risk of contracting COVID-19, we should wash our hands, maintain a safe distance around others, and wear a face mask. The practices of this basic nature can be utilized for practices of a basic nature in cybersecurity safety, such as not using the same password for different accounts, or not accessing skeptical emails from unknown sources. If a file downloaded by the user is contaminated, it can at first have asymptomatic effects, much like COVID-19. The contamination can spread to various files and data on a computer, and if sent to another user, their machine will have contracted it too. This is synonymous to the operation and contraction of a virus. Both of these threats push people out of their comfort zone and cause them to take countermeasures not utilized frequently. There can be behaviors such as negative behavior or behaviors that put people at risk. Some users might find the steps taken to avoid a cyber attack tedious and cumbersome, which may cause them to overlook the practices if done for an extensive amount of time. Just like during the pandemic, people may have found the act of constantly disinfecting countertops and sanitizing hands tiresome. But if these processes are ignored, it will increase a chance of exposure to a virus or a cyber attack. Likewise, there could be positive behavior or such behavior that decreases the chance of risk. For the COVID-19 pandemic, behaviors such as wearing masks to keep others safe. This helped decrease the risk of contracting the virus and reduce the possibility of others contracting it. This is comparable to not using personal devices at work. As a result, confidential information will not be leaked, and data will maintain its integrity and confidentiality. Now, the authors also discuss the messaging used during the pandemic and how effective it was in informing the population by keeping concepts simple. The authors think that cybersecurity could benefit from a similar messaging style, as it would effectively deliver the importance of cybersecurity, as well as instruct the steps that users should follow. However, at the time of publishing, there have been no slogans to aid users in retaining the instructions and benefit of cybersecurity practices. Both threats have the issue where as they continue to develop, so too should the messaging in order to minimize the number of gray areas. Once again, we can use the example of restricting personal devices at work. If utilized, confidentiality is better maintained, as no employees have access to their camera or personal email anymore. However, say devices are allowed at the company, gray areas could potentially start to appear. Questions will need to be answered, such as where on the premise can they be used, what can be accessed on it. The authors then create a relation to the gray areas of the pandemic, such as how many people could be allowed in a social gathering at once. In conclusion of the paper, the authors summarize what cybersecurity can learn from the experience of COVID-19 and its pandemic. They say that meaningful messaging must be developed for cybersecurity practices, as well as the motivation of this messaging needs to be clear to everyone as to why these practices are essential. In the case of a cyber attack, the severity of the consequences must be known so that people take the problem seriously. And lastly, the authors suggest for a hierarchical defense in cybersecurity, and they relate it to the workplace protocols that took place in the case that somebody contracted COVID-19. When doing some research on IEEE Explorer, I found that there were discussions on many topics relating cybersecurity and the pandemic. One that particularly caught my eye was written regarding the student dropout levels during the implementation of cybersecurity programs. This topic alone further proves the need for all of us, both STEM and non-STEM majors, to have familiarity with cybersecurity practices. In this way, users will have a better understanding of what software to trust as well as what software not to trust. And we can use an example that we all experienced. So as most students are aware, during the pandemic, UT Dallas utilized screen recording software and camera use in order to proctor the students as they take exams. Many students, as well as professors, however, were cautious to trust the software. In a result, many professors chose not to use the software and trusted students to the honor system. This ultimately created gray areas, and if students chose not to abide by the honor system, it put the university's integrity at risk. Overall, I thought that this paper has a really unique approach to generating awareness of the cybersecurity field by comparing it to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I do believe it has a couple faults. I think the biggest fault of this paper is that it does not initially motivate the importance of cybersecurity. Now, towards the end, they do discuss that cybersecurity can utilize messaging, and they describe the severity of a cyber attack. But I believe that a paragraph at the beginning spent on explaining the severity of an attack would have further motivated their desire to educate cybersecurity practices and further motivated readers to take these concepts more serious. I think that real-world consequences could have been explained to help motivate, such as your bank account information being leaked, the university accidentally revealing your personal information. Another fault I believe this paper had was that the authors relate only practices of cybersecurity basic in nature. Now, it can be argued that for most of the population, these basics are really all that need to be covered. But I believe that there's a lot of benefits to learning more complex cybersecurity practices, and that their relations can also introduce these more complex cybersecurity practices. I'd like to propose a few extensions for this paper. So when discussing basic practices such as password changes, the enabling of read and write access can also be introduced. This is utilized to prevent or grant access to groups or others who are not the owner of the file. It can be beneficial for personal files, and it can be used at companies to prevent data leaks as well as preserve confidentiality. I'd also like to propose a creation of messaging for the read and write abilities. For example, stop, analysis, access. Stop tells a user to stop at the file. For analysis, check your accessibility. And then access. If read access is enabled, then access the contents within the file. To further expand on the idea of company information being leaked, it is beneficial to inform the reader about cybersecurity models already implemented for companies, such as defense contractors, and that helps maintain their confidentiality and integrity of their data. So we've discussed these in class. There's a hierarchical defense, such as the Bell-LaPadula model, which assigns people a level of security to dictate what information they can access and modify. Another hierarchical defense that exists is the Chinese wall model. This helps prevent users from creating conflicts of interest between companies after accessing information from one of them. Both of these defenses also simultaneously satisfy the author's want for a hierarchical defense in cybersecurity, much like the workplace protocols for COVID-19 that he related it to. Therefore, if I was to extend on these papers, I would add in these more complicated aspects of cybersecurity, as I feel it was ultimately a missed opportunity by the authors. In conclusion, the scholar paper was very interesting to read. As I continue my studies in this class, the more strongly I believe that society needs exposure to cybersecurity practices. This paper effectively compares and analyzes cybersecurity to the pandemic. However, it does only very basic practices. The paper can be further expanded on by including more complex cybersecurity practices, such as the read and write, access, and detailed hierarchical implementations explained in the extension section. The severity as well as consequences of an attack can also be discussed at the beginning of the paper. This will in turn help to motivate readers to be more careful when online and grab their attention at the beginning, allowing the authors to compare and introduce concepts throughout their paper more effectively. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.